Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So like I've mentioned several times on this channel before, I am very new to this whole retro handheld game thing. It was about 10 months ago when I got my first device, which was the Anbernic RG350. And over that period of time, a lot of people have recommended this device to me. It is the GKD GKD350H. And this device actually came out around the same time as the RG350 in the fall of 2019. Now what makes this one in particular special is it's been modded by my friend Eddie over at myretrogamecase.com. And some of the upgrades he did was to add a PS Vita analog stick, an OCA laminated display, L2 and R2 buttons, as well as an upgraded battery. And if you want to learn more about why he did these mods and how he did these mods, I would encourage you to go over to the Always Be Fun YouTube channel, which is Eddie's channel there, and he shows off how he actually does this mod. And it's pretty ingenious, the way that he rewired everything and got it all hooked up. And I thought to myself, if there's someone out there who loves this device so much that they're willing to take all this time to make these upgrades and then sell them themselves out of their own store, I think it's something worth checking out. And that's what we're going to do today. Now this isn't my first modded device from myretrogamecase.com. I've done two others. The first was a metal case mod for my RGB10. Additionally, Eddie made a customized Game Boy Advance with a CM3 chip inside, and I have a video on that one too. I really love this one. So I was pretty excited to see what it was about this device. And he has a couple different colors that are available. I chose the green one with the black buttons, but you have different options available on his website. Inside the box, you're going to find a micro USB cable and then some instructions in Chinese. Don't worry about those. And moment of truth, here it is. So first thing that caught my eye was the OCA laminated display. It looks very nice and it's a little bit recessed. And I always appreciate it when you have an easy to access battery like this so you don't have to take the device apart. That being said, it is super hard to get this back case off, so it's almost like taking it apart. Now interestingly enough, there's actually a hole cut out of the back case in order to access the internal SD card, but the hole isn't big enough to actually access it. So it's a nice sentiment, but you actually still have to open up the case to get into that internal SD card. But I thought that was pretty funny. Overall, I actually like this green translucent color. It reminds me of like a 90s device, and I think that's pretty cool. Okay, on the top here you have your external SD card slot, and then you can see here these are the shoulder buttons. Now these are actually 3D printed, and then he uses a special control board to add these two different button functions. Now here's the D-pad. It feels very natural in the hands, and it's a pretty good size. The only issue I have with it is that it protrudes a little bit too much from the case itself. Like when you push down on it, it doesn't really go as far as I would like it to. But all the same, it pivots and it has like a slightly mushy feel to it, all the things I like in an old school D-pad. And I'm a big fan of these PS Vita analog sticks, so I'm really happy that he added those in there. Originally the device had like an analog slider thing, and he said it was a lot of work to get this working. And I appreciate that we have a true analog stick now. When it comes to the face buttons, paradoxically they actually have the PlayStation symbols on them, but then you can also see the A, B, and XY written into the case themselves. It's just kind of funny. Now these buttons have the same issue as the D-pad in that they protrude a lot and they don't go all the way down. I don't need them to be flush with the case, but I do definitely feel that they stick out a lot even when you push down on them. These start and select buttons are made out of hard plastic as well, and they feel really good. They're some of my favorite buttons on this device. So let's go ahead and turn this on and see what it's like. So as you can see, it's running a version of OpenDingX as its operating system. And it has that same kind of OpenDingX interface that you would expect from any of these devices that came out in 2019, 2020. All you do is just navigate to your games, into your emulator, start up your games that way. It's not the most beautiful of processes, but it's fairly intuitive. So I'm just going to grab an external SD card from one of my other devices. Here's my RG350M. And I'm going to pop it right into here, and I'm going to access my games through that external SD card. So, like I mentioned, you just boot up an emulator, and then you navigate to wherever that game is, and then you start it up. And here we are. So one thing you might notice, there's no volume button on this device at all. So what you have to do is you hold down the start button, and then do up and down for brightness controls, and then left and right for volume controls. And I always love to have like a dedicated volume wheel, but at the same time, it's pretty easy to remember that. Now when it comes to just general gameplay, everything feels really solid in my hands. The device has a very light, like plasticky feel to it, which I don't think is a bad thing. It feels very much so like a retro handheld. And it's very obvious that this is a mixture of like factory made plus homemade. So for example, here with the PS Vita analog stick, you can still see the adhesive that he used in order to keep it fused together. Some people might not like that, but I kind of don't mind. I like the feel of the fact that somebody took the time and did their best with it. And it's not perfect, obviously, but none of these systems ever are. Overall, I like the smooth plastic feel of it, and I like the seam along the ends here. It just feels very natural in the hands. And I forgot to mention up top, we have a headphone jack as well as your micro USB charging port. All in all, I would say it's a very comfortable device to hold. The edges are slightly rounded, which makes it just feel very nice, and it's a very light device, which kind of gives it like a easy experience to hold. It's hard to explain, but it does have a very natural feel to it in my hands. Okay, let's get into some gameplay. Let me show you what this is all about. We'll start with NES here. Performance is just about perfect. Now this is a 320 by 240 display, same thing that you would find on, for example, the RG350. And because of that low resolution, it's not going to scale perfectly, so you're going to want to put on something like bilinear filtering, which they call full speed smooth in a lot of these old emulators. But I think it looks fine, you know, everything's a little bit soft and rounded around the edges, but it's very fitting for things like Nintendo games. Performance-wise, it's perfect. Honestly, it feels a lot like playing my RG350. Moving over to Super Nintendo, you have the same scaling issues here, so you're going to want to use that bilinear filtering. But again, I don't really mind that soft look, especially on an old handheld like this. Now, booting up some of those harder Super Nintendo games is where things get real. Because a lot of people don't actually realize this, and personally I didn't realize it either until I actually had the device, is that this uses a chipset that's actually a faster processor than what's on the 350 devices. What that means is that games like Yoshi's Island, which struggles on the RG350 series, it plays perfectly on here. There's no frame rate dips at all. So this has a native clock speed of 1.5 GHz, and you can also overclock it up to 1.9 as well. That's some pretty hefty processing power for this little device, and not something that I initially expected. Things like Genesis, Sega CD, they play just perfectly. Same thing with Game Boy Advance, I had no issues playing any of the games on here. Now I want to spend the bulk of my attention here on the PlayStation 1. This is basically the upper limit of this device. And when it comes down to it, most of your standard PS1 games, things like Jumping Flash or Hot Shots Golf 2, they're all going to play just fine with this. There's no issues here. And these played fine on the 350 as well. I would say that overall, 95% of the PS1 games that are in the catalog are going to play perfectly on this device. And honestly, these games look really good with this 4:3 aspect ratio and 320 by 240 resolution. Now the menus and everything else do not look as crisp as they would on, say, an RG350M, but bear in mind that this costs about half the price of an RG350M, so you're really paying for that 640 by 480 display if you get that model. Now some PS1 games that don't do so hot on the RG350 series actually do really well on this device. One good example is Final Fantasy IX. If you take the RG350 and you try to start up the first battle, there's all sorts of stutters when that battle first starts. But as you can see on this one, it's having no issues at all, solid 60 frames per second throughout the entire battle. So if you're looking for a device to play some old school role-playing games, you know, PlayStation 1 games, even some Super Nintendo games, they're all going to run just about perfectly on this device. And that's not something I can say about the RG350 series. Now let me show you how to overclock real quick. It's very easy in this device. You just go into settings, and then under CPU performance, you pick between 1 and 7 levels here. So let's set it to level 4 here, and I'm going to start up a PS1 game that is notoriously hard to run, which is Bloody Roar 2. Now surprisingly, when I'm playing this game with an overclock level of 4, it feels very good in terms of speed and just kind of like the button reactions while I'm playing. And so even though it's showing a frames per second of dipping down to about 50 or so, I'm actually not feeling that while I'm playing it. So I would say the jury's still out on this one. I'm not really sure if the frames per second are a reflection of what actually is happening, or maybe I'm just being optimistic about the gameplay experience itself. But overall, other than games like Bloody Roar 2 and Tekken 3, I experienced 0 FPS dips. And that's pretty good for PlayStation 1 at this price. Now I should mention, all this gameplay experience right now is using the stock emulators that came with the device. And for the most part they run pretty well, but some of them are not so great. So for example, with Final Burn Alpha, you can see here that it really struggles to play any CPS3 games. Red Earth has a really hard time playing at full speed. And same thing here with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. To me, this is completely unplayable. Now anything using CPS 2 or earlier, it's going to play just fine. Here's Street Fighter Alpha 3 running at full speed. But I should mention that as I started playing some fighting games, this is when I realized that this device was not really well suited for fighting games. The first thing is the D-pad. It just sticks out too much. And I found that it started to hurt my thumb when I was throwing Hadoukens and things like that. Now unfortunately, same thing with these shoulder buttons. They're not very responsive. They don't have a lot of travel to them. And so if you're trying to pull off very fast moves on this, it's not going to feel very good. You can't really like rapid press these buttons. They just don't bounce up quickly enough. And same thing here with the face buttons, because they protrude so much when you're pushing down, it just kind of feels weird with your thumb because you never actually make contact with the case itself. It kind of feels like your fingers are floating while you're pushing on these buttons. In short, these buttons just stick out too much. So one of my favorite features of this device is that it has USB connectivity. So you just plug it into your computer and then you can select the USB mode, and just like that you can access everything on your computer itself. No FTP or any of the other things that you have to do with the 350 series. You can see here I have access to the ROMs folder of my internal drive, and these are all the ROMs that come preloaded with the device here. So you can go through here and delete them and add other ones, whatever you wanted to do. And then on the other side I have my external SD card. And here I can access everything. On top of that I can actually add my own apps. And you're probably thinking to yourself, how do I get new apps for this device? And I would say, thank you for asking that question, and let me show you how. So a couple months ago, GameKitty released their next device, which is called the GKD Mini. And this has the same hardware and everything as the original. And luckily, despite the fact that this is actually a closed source operating system, people in the community were able to actually grab all the updated apps that they had on this newer device, and they all work perfectly with the old one. So I'll have a link to this in my written guide, which is in the video description, but you can just go in here into the latest OPKs and then grab all the new apps, and it's super easy. Additionally, if you want to flash the updated firmware, you could do that as well. Now I personally haven't done that yet, just because of the fact that the regular operating system seems to work just fine. But if you want to have the latest and greatest, this is how you do it. And again, I'll have this in my video description. So after adding in a couple of these new emulators, you can see here they're actually running really well. So here's Red Earth running with the new Final Burn Alpha OPK. And it's not running at 60 frames per second, but it's getting pretty close. And this is miles better than it was with the previous emulator. And on top of that, there are other developers who have been making emulators for this device specifically. So as you can see here, there's actually a semi-working version of the Nintendo DS emulator. It's definitely not perfect. For example, I can't figure out how to get it to register my button presses, but overall it's playing a lot faster than I expected it to. Now bear in mind this is with an overclock of 7, so I overclocked it as much as it would go, so it'll drain your battery pretty quickly. But until I can figure out how to use these buttons, it's basically useless anyway. But another emulator that's been updated recently is the Pico Drive emulator. And with the original stock Pico Drive, you actually couldn't play any 32X. But as you can see here, with the new Pico Drive, it's running at 60 frames per second. So overall, yes, this is definitely not as popular as like the RG350 series, but all the same, there are some dedicated developers who have been making new strides for this device. And even things like the simple menu front end work for this device. Okay, so that's game performance, which is actually very impressive. Now let's talk about some of the competition. So here's the RG350 here. This is my original device here. I've made some mods to it. For example, I've installed a 640 by 480 display from the RG350M. I've also changed up the analog sticks. And obviously the analog sticks on the RG350 are much better because there's 2 of them. Additionally, the 350 has stereo speakers, whereas the GKD350H only has 1 single mono speaker, which doesn't have very good sound either. Now the successor to the RG350 is the RG350P. This has the same internals as the 350, basically the same device, except that it has 2 analog sticks on the bottom and they're Nintendo Switch style sticks. This one also has stereo speakers, and it has the internal and external SD cards available right then and there. With the 350, you actually have to go inside the device to get the internal card, and like I showed you with the 350H here, you have to get inside to get that one too. And finally, just for comparison's sakes, here is the PlayGo. This is basically a clone of the new Pocket Go V2, and it has the same chipset as the RG350, and it's a very similar device. This one also has a 320 by 240 display, a mono speaker, and then it has that old school analog slider, which is probably the worst out of all of these 4. On top of that, the PlayGo buttons kind of wobble a little bit, and that's not very present on the other ones. The PlayGo also has a fatter D-pad compared to the others. I would say of all of these, the GameKitty350H probably has the worst D-pad. It's not a bad D-pad, but by comparison, I would prefer the other ones over this. Okay, let's compare some weights here. So the GameKitty350H weighs 156 grams, that's pretty light. Compare that to 180 grams for the 350P, or even 170 grams for the 350. Even something like the PlayGo, which is quite a bit smaller and more compact than the GameKitty350H, it still weighs more than the 350H. Like I said, this is a very light device. Of course, something like the 350M weighs a full 100 grams more than the GameKitty350H, but even the mini device, the RG280V, only weighs about 30 grams less than the GameKitty350H. So just in terms of being very lightweight and pocketable, this is a very good device for that. Okay, wrapping things up here, let's go over what I like and what I don't like. We'll start with what I like. Number 1, I really like the CPU. It's a little bit more powerful than the RG350, and it really hits where it matters the most. This has a very nice display, and Eddie added a tempered glass protector over it, which makes it even better. And it's a very lightweight device. Other things I like is the USB interface that you can just plug this right into your computer, and it has a solid 6 hours of battery life. And finally, I also like the upgrades that he made to the analog stick, as well as having the L2 and R2 button functionality. It may not be perfect, but I really appreciate that it's there in the first place. So all in all, a lot of positives here. And honestly, half of the things that I like about this device are due to the mods that my retro game case added. Okay, let's talk about what I don't like now. Number one, in general, just all these devices that run OpenDingux do require a bit of configuration. Now you kind of have to do this with any emulation device, but it's a very prominent experience when you're using something like this or the RG350 series. Like I mentioned, the buttons protrude a lot, including the D-pad. And I think over time I would probably get used to it, but right off the bat, after having tested about 30 different devices at this point in the game, that's something that really stood out to me. And I also am not a fan of the fact that this is a closed source operating system. It's just really unfortunate that someone decided to make everything hard for the community to help improve the device. It's just kind of a boneheaded move. Additionally, this isn't really a fault of the device itself, more like a sign of the times, but it uses a micro USB port for charging. So it does feel like a little bit step back in time here in 2021, but again, not a huge deal breaker. And overall, I'm not a fan of the sound of the mono speaker as well as the fact that where it's placed, because I tend to cover it with my thumb as I'm playing. And that just kind of sucks, right? Like they made this speaker and then you cover it up and you can't hear anything. And finally, this one isn't really like a total negative, but the 3D printed shoulder buttons are just kind of underwhelming. They definitely don't have that same level of quality when compared to the other buttons on the same device. And it's understandable, 3D printed things never kind of have that same quality as something that's manufactured. And really, the functionality of the fact that you now have R2 and L2 buttons kind of wins me over anyway. And that's why I didn't make this like a red X, but just kind of put it in the red section. So yeah, overall, this is a very interesting device. When I first heard about it, I was not interested at all. I thought, well, this is probably just like any of the other RG350 devices. But little did I know that it has a better chipset, and it kind of has a nicer unified feel to it. And sure, it has these little quirks. For example, why does it have PlayStation symbols on the buttons? And I really have mixed feelings about these shoulder buttons. I really appreciate all the work that went into making them actually function, but in practice, they're not very fun to push down on. And of course, I appreciate all the little things about this device. I like the easy to access battery compartment. And I'm impressed by the amount of attention and detail that Eddie at my retro game case put into actually putting all this together. Swapping out that analog stick and adding in those extra buttons is just like a really neat labor of love. And I can kind of feel that when I'm holding this device. And one last note here is I really like the recessed display on this device. So if you were to lay this on its face, the screen wouldn't even touch the surface of what you're laying it down on. Okay, so about 20 minutes into it at this point, what do I actually feel about this device? How do I like it? Well, honestly, I'm kind of torn. First, I really appreciate what this device can provide. I like the faster chipset. In general, it just feels like a very good device. But at the same time, it's kind of locked down. It's closed source, and you can maybe add some updated emulators or flash the new stock firmware from the GKD Mini, but that's really about it. There is a new operating system that just came out for these devices. It's called IUX, but it hasn't been translated over to English yet. So I think once I get my hands on a GKD Mini, I'm going to try out that operating system and show you what that's all about too. But yeah, overall, it's kind of a weird experience, right? I appreciate this device now that I've been playing with retro handhelds for about 10 months. But if this had been my first retro handheld device, I don't think I'd be where I am today. Because the openness of the RG350 is really what got me excited about this community in the first place. And so if you're in the market for your very first device, I would probably say this is not your best choice. But if you're someone who likes to collect things, or potentially you want to have just a very unique device, I would say go for it. This is a pretty cool device. And I do love that mixture of like manufactured in a factory, mixed with like all these homemade upgrades, which just give it a lot more character and personality. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming!